Hello and welcome to almost our very last video. We're going to have two videos on Revelation, and then I'm going to have one concluding video which I'll tell you a bit more about tomorrow. So today I'm going to give you some overview stuff about the book of Revelation, talk a bit about symbolism, hopefully pass on some ideas to how to interpret it, maybe make some suggestions about misconceptions that you might want to lose if you happen to have them. We'll talk about some general things. I'll take you on a quick kind of overview of the book. Tomorrow I'm going to look at one particular theme in the book and try and bring that out for you. What I'm not going to do for you, as you'll know by now having watched all of the other videos, or even if you've watched any of the other videos, I'm not going to break open every secret of this book, and in particular I'm not going to be able to break open every secret of the book of Revelation, because this is one of the hardest, one of the most perplexing and mysterious. But there are some important things that we can say, and I will try and say some of those. Okay, so who wrote it? Usual sort of question. It's identified as being written by John to the 7 churches in Asia. That's chapter 1, verse 4. Now, we're not sure which John that is. Traditionally believed to have been John the Apostle. I think consensus scholarship now is that it isn't John the Apostle, that it's John the Seer, but we're not quite sure really who that character is, or indeed exactly when he was writing. I'm not going to get too hung up on those details, because I don't think in the end they make a huge difference to the at least the broad brushstrokes of the interpretation. What we do need to understand is that this is written by whoever wrote it, John the Seer. He's in exile on Patmos. Patmos is a small island off the Turkish coast, and from Patmos he could see, or at least imagine he could see, the Turkish coastline and the churches that he is pastor of. And in the first part of the book he writes to these churches. He writes a word given to him by Jesus in his vision to these churches. In fact, the whole book really is cast as a letter to the churches he has care for. And the particular thing about the churches that we need to hold in our minds is that this is a book written to a persecuted church. Now, we've said that quite a lot about quite a lot of the New Testament books, but this is true par excellence of this book. Now, you and I, if you like me live in Britain or in a liberal Western democracy, we do not experience persecution. The worst we ever experience is a little bit of hardship, a little bit of inconvenience for our faith. But I would suggest that we don't experience persecution for our faith. So when we read the book of Revelation, I'd like to suggest that we read it as privileged eavesdroppers. I mentioned, I think a little while ago, I think it's when we were talking about the book of Acts, about an experience I had when I was at the Middle East consultation a few years ago in Lebanon. And there I was listening in, as it were, on as part of conversations, but really I regarded myself as a privileged eavesdropper on conversations among Middle Eastern Christian leaders and North African Christian leaders. And many of these were people who were experiencing intense persecution and intense hardship for their faith. And I regarded myself as a privileged eavesdropper there, someone who was who had not been tested in the way that they were. And I was there to learn and to listen. And this, I think, is a good attitude to read the book of Revelation with. Now, there are at least 5 major schools of interpretation of this book. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm certainly not going to weigh them all. But I do suggest that understanding it as being written to a persecuted church is the most important hermeneutical key, the most important interpretive key that we can apply to this book. And if we forget that, and if we somehow imagine that it is written to you and me in the 21st century, we're going to badly misinterpret it. And I've got a favourite saying, I think I've said it before in these videos: bad theology makes people kill each other. This book is one of the key places where bad theology sometimes emerges because it's badly interpreted, and where that bad theology can be very, very dangerous indeed. So we need to read it with great humility and with great caution, I suggest. Not at all saying we shouldn't read it. I think it has important things to teach us, but we need to read it with humility and caution. And do our homework to the best of our ability in order to try and interpret it to the best of our ability. Now, this is an apocalypse. I've spoken a fair bit about apocalypses. I think I spoke about apocalypses when we looked at Joel. I think I may have spoken about it a little bit when we looked at Ezekiel, and possibly when we looked at Zechariah, and also very briefly yesterday when we talked about Jude. Now, apocalypse was, just to recap, was a literary form that emerged in the intertestamental period between the writings of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is a form that emerges out of persecution. It is one of the key things about apocalypse is its message is communicated through visions and dreams. Symbolisms are fantastical in apocalypses. If, for example, let me just show you an example. If you turn to Luke, which is not an apocalypse, if you turn to Luke chapter 17, verse 37, for example. Now, in Luke 17, verse 37, so Jesus has been talking about kind of end times stuff. He's been speaking about women grinding corn together, one will be taken, the other left. And the disciples say to him, "Where, Lord?" And he says to them, "Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Now, it's a little bit of a tricky saying, but the interpretation is kind of directly mappable. It's a little mini parable, really. You can directly map the interpretation from the idea of a corpse and vultures. It kind of, with a bit of thought, it kind of works for us as well as it did for the ancient readers. Now, compare that with Revelation 9, just for example, verses 7 to 10. So Revelation 9, verses 7 to 10 speaks about no, it doesn't. I'm the wrong chapter. It speaks about locusts prepared for battle, with crowns of gold on their head, and faces like human hair, and hair like women's hair. Faces like human faces, hair like women's hair, teeth like lions' teeth, wearing breastplates of iron, and the noise of their wings being like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. Now, the previous example I gave you of locusts hovering over corpses is a familiar one. We will have vultures hovering over corpses, is a familiar one. We will have seen it ourselves, or we will certainly have seen it on wildlife programs on the television. But this image of locusts with human faces and breastplates and crowns and things is just frankly bewildering. And it's very hard, and we cannot immediately interpret it in the way that we can something like those words of Jesus. Another feature of apocalyptic writing is that the writing is highly stylized, and there is symbolic use of numbers. Numbers are pretty much always used symbolically in apocalyptic writing, and so we get a lot of sevens. I'm going to show you those. We get 144,000, for example. 144,000 would represent 12 times 12 times a whole lot, which 1,000 represents, and 12, of course, being the number of the tribes. And so these numbers are symbolic. These numbers are meant to remind us of other things. Now, I've spoken to you about other apocalypses. Enoch, 1 Enoch is another apocalypse. I quoted from that, I think, when I spoke about the intertestamental literature. And I also referred to it yesterday when we were talking about Jude, because Jude uses the book of Enoch quite a bit. And I think I read to you in that intertestamental video, I think I read you a short excerpt from 1 Enoch, which sounds remarkably like, by no means identical, but remarkable points of similarity with the vision of the risen Christ, which John has in Revelation 1. Now, unlike the other apocalypses, Revelation has some differences. It's written later because it's not written in the intertestamental period, by definition. And it's not written in a time of prophetic silence, which kind of required pseudonymity, required it to be written kind of anonymously and under secret seal. This is written, it's written for the church, and it's written to be read. It's not intended to be sealed up secretly, which was often the way with the other apocalypses, but this is intended to be read. However, there is quite a lot of kind of secret language and code there, not intended to obscure it entirely, but intended to obscure it from the eyes of the unfriendly, of whom there were plenty, as I've already implied. Some principles for interpreting this book. The first thing I suggest is that we seek the author's original intention as best we can deduce it. And that means we try to work out what the author is saying to his intended audience. And when we work out what the author was saying to his intended audience, we can then start to draw some conclusions about what the author is saying to us, or what God rather might be saying to us in this book. But the first step is to try and work out what the author was saying to his original audience. Now, this is always true, but especially with a difficult book like this one. Now, one of the principles of interpretation is that Scripture interprets Scripture, but we need to be a little bit cautious here. It certainly helps us, but if we over-egg it, if we overdo that, we're going to trap ourselves, because Revelation uses imagery in ways that much of the rest of Scripture doesn't. And if we simply kind of drag and drop other things from the Old Testament, for example, into Revelation, or hold them alongside Revelation incautiously, then we may end up with misinterpretations. Let's talk a little bit about the imagery, the way that Revelation uses imagery. Now, I'm going to describe an image to you. Okay, nothing to do with Revelation. The image is of a bear, and the bear has it's got fierce teeth, and the teeth are dripping with blood. The bear has a saddle on it, and on the saddle is imprinted a hammer and a sickle. Now, what does that bear represent to you? Now, unless you're very young, it will almost certainly represent the Soviet Union to you, because a bear often was used to represent Soviet Russia. Hammer and sickle would reinforce that image, and the idea of the sharp teeth dripping blood would be communicating something about how the artist was wanting to portray the Soviet Union. Now, supposing I now show you another picture, and the picture is of somebody with a dragon on their face. Have I used this image before when I did the intertestamental lectures? If I have, please forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But the image is of someone with a dragon painted on their face, a red dragon, and then the background and the top of it is white and the bottom of it is green. And if you saw that, I think you would almost immediately assume that this was a Welsh rugby supporter who's got the Welsh dragon and the Welsh flag painted on their face, and that they're probably off to a match. So we instantly and easily interpret those images, but in thousands of years' time, in a different culture, those images will be by no means so instantly meaningful for the readers. And this is the problem that we have reading the book of Revelation. Some of the images that are being used are images that are unfamiliar to us. Now, I think I may have said some of this before, but I'm hopefully not overlapping myself too much. So there is Old Testament, there is imagery in Revelation which is using Old Testament images in much the same way. So we saw in Daniel beasts emerging from the sea, and those beasts represented world rulers. And here in Revelation 2, we will see a beast emerging out of the sea, and that beast will represent a world ruler. So if we're familiar with our Old Testament, then we will be able to interpret that without too much difficulty. We're also going to see, and here as we're getting some slight change to the Old Testament usage, we're going to see a prostitute, and the prostitute is named Babylon. Now, we meet a prostitute called Babylon in a number of Old Testament books, and certainly that imagery is being picked up and used by our author of Revelation, but it's not being entirely unaltered. So the prostitute Babylon in the Old Testament prophetic literature was intended to represent the empire of Babylon, and it was intended to represent her pride and her abusiveness and her idolatry, in a nutshell. Now, Babylon as an entity, as a geopolitical power, doesn't exist in the time of Revelation, but Rome does. And our writer uses this language that was used to criticize the oppressive empire of Babylon. He uses that same language to criticize the oppressive empire of Rome in his own day. As it were, Rome is filling the same slot that Babylon slotted, the powerful, abusive oppressor of God's people. And so when our writer says, things about Babylon, everybody knows. And actually he makes it really clear, because the prostitute Babylon in Revelation, is it 9, is sitting on 7 hills, which is very, very, not Revelation 9, but is sitting on 7 hills. And that's a very clear image of Rome, which was has the goddess Roma seated on 7 hills in the kind of literature and the imagery of the day. So he says Babylon, and everybody knows he's talking about Rome. Everyone who matters, everyone for whom the book is intended, understands that he's talking about Rome. But with a bit of luck, it might slip past the censors. One of the things we need to do is to not overpress details. If I went back to those locusts that I read to you about a moment ago, the vision of fierce attacking things with long blonde hair in armour would bring to mind the barbarian hordes, people like the Gauls and the Goths and so on, which are maybe slightly anachronistic with the Goths. I think they may be slightly later than this, but certainly the barbarian hordes, the idea of the kind of the people outside the empire who attacked the empire, or whom the empire attacked. This is the image that is being interpreted here, being relayed to us here, rather. We mustn't over-interpret that. We mustn't sit and, as people have done, and said, oh, the length of the hair, it represents, so many days, or the existence of, the breastplate, it represents this, and so on. It's a kind of impressionistic image to bring to mind something that the ancient readers would have understood, and we would need to work a bit harder to understand. Hope this is making sense so far. Quick comment about chronology. Apocalypses are above mundane things like chronology. They don't tell their story chronologically. They tell it thematically. They sort of sketch it out. They map it. They gesture at it. Let me talk a little bit about the dragon, or the serpent, in Revelation, because this taps with a theme that we have been looking at on and off since the very, very first video. Where I spoke, at least the second, maybe it was the second, but where I spoke, I think it was the first, about the serpent in Genesis 3. And we have seen this serpent whose head is to be crushed. That's cropped up from time to time. And this serpent represents one of the ancient monsters of chaos, or the chaos monster who has to be suppressed and held back and suppressed and ultimately slain by God. And so we see, and this is part of the ancient Near Eastern language, the ancient Near Eastern ideas, which are being picked up in this Greco-Roman world by our writer. So we had it in Genesis 3, we have it in Akkadian myths, we have it in Babylonian myths and Assyrian myths, and so on. We've seen it in the Old Testament. I've said in Genesis 3, we see it in Isaiah, Isaiah 51 verse 9, where Isaiah says to God, was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? This is language of killing the monster of chaos. It's nothing to do with the woman Rahab, by the way, from Joshua. We see it in Isaiah 27 verse 1. In that day, this is the day of the Lord, the day of God's decisive action in history. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. This is all chaos imagery. So we see Leviathan, Rahab, Tannin, these are the names for these monsters of chaos. The sea itself represents chaos. And we see all of these themes here in Revelation. Revelation 20, verse 2. An angel comes down and he seizes the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and he binds him for 1,000 years. Revelation 21 verse 1, the new heavens and the new earth, and the sea is no more. We're not supposed to understand that we can't go sailing in the new heavens and the new earth, which would upset my daughter very much because she's a very keen sailor. But the idea that chaos itself has now been annihilated, has been exterminated, because God has now finally and definitively conquered the dragon. Okay, that was a very brief comment on that imagery. What else do I want to say? So the historical context I've already touched on, which is that John is in exile and his readers are, chapter 1 verse 9, companions with him in his suffering. And the suffering of the readers is a major theme in the book. I'm going to just read through some references you can glance at for yourself. Chapter 2 verses 3, 8 to 9 and 13, chapter 3 verse 10, chapter 6 verses 9 to 11, chapter 7 verses 14 to 16, chapter 12 verses 11 to 17, chapter 13 verse 7, chapter 14 verses 9 to 13, chapter 16 verses 5 to 6, 18 verse 20, and 19 verse 2. And I'm having to move fast because I've realised I've been talking for 20 minutes already. And if we read this with attention to the right things, then we will discover that the church and the state are on a collision course, and the suffering of the church is because of the persecution that the state is imposing upon it. Now, one thing we need to do in order to understand this well is we need to understand the difference between tribulation and wrath, and it depends to some extent what your translation is. But tribulation is something that the church has to endure. Tribulation is the suffering of this present time, in particular the suffering of persecution. But wrath is the judgment of God which falls on those who have persecuted God's people. The church endures tribulation, but the church does not endure wrath. The saints have to endure persecution and tribulation, but the saints are not subject to wrath because of the blood of the Lamb. An important distinction, and if we miss the distinction there, we will misinterpret. There's another way that we can misinterpret this book. Now, understanding then this historical context helps us to spot the two crucial questions in this book. And the two crucial questions are the opening of the 5th and 6th seals. Chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. And who is it asking this? I think it's the martyrs under the altar. Those who have been slain for the word of God and for the witness they have borne. And there are more martyrs in this century, or certainly in the 20th century, than ever before. And I honour them, and we should honour them, I think. And the martyrs here cry out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? How long must we endure this? That's the first cry, the great cry of the church, the suffering church, through the generations. How long, O Lord, as the psalmist taught them to pray. And then the second great question. This is the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals. They are hiding themselves, calling on the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and conceal them before the blazing wrath of God. And they say, the great day of God's wrath has come. Who can stand? Who can stand? And the answer is those who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. They're the only ones who can stand. These are the two great questions of Revelation. How long, O Lord, and who can stand? Now, I've spoken a bit about judgment already, but I just will remind you of the image I used of the siren in the middle of the night, and whether that is good news or bad news, and it depends whether you are the woman who's been violently assaulted or the man who has assaulted her. And obviously this isn't a gender thing, that's just a particular example. But judgment is good news for those who are oppressed. Judgment is good news for those who suffer. Judgment is God's righting of all wrongs. And I say, bring it on. And I say it in good company because this is the message of Revelation, I think. I am going to change my mind slightly. I'm going to break the video here. Tomorrow I'm going to give you the overview of the book that I promised you, and then I'm going to drill down on one particular theme, and I hope I manage both of those in one video.